In 1974, a pound of ground beef cost 69 cents, a can of tomatoes cost 12 cents, and a family of 5 ate dinner for under $2 every single night of the week. Most people think that sounds like hardship. The families who lived it called it Tuesday. And here is what the food history books almost never mention. Number 18 on this list appeared in more rural church cookbooks across Arkansas than any other single dish, and almost nobody outside a 2-county radius has ever heard of it. Number 11 kept working families fed through 2 recessions and a decade of inflation, and it cost under $1.50 for a family of 6. These are not the fancy failures of the 1970s and 1980s, the aspic molds and the fondue pots and the dishes that deserve to disappear. These are the 25 country dishes that fed real people through real hard times, that cost under $5 for a whole family, and that we have let quietly go without ever deciding to. Hit subscribe and let's count them down together. Tallerine. In the rural kitchens of Arkansas in the 1970s, the church cookbook was not a collection of fancy recipes. It was a survival document. And on the potluck tables of every Baptist and Methodist congregation from Fort Smith to Jonesboro, there sat a casserole that nobody outside the state had ever heard of, and that every family inside it made their own way. Tallerine was ground beef, egg noodles, Velveeta cheese, and a small can of sliced black olives, combined in a baking dish and baked until the cheese melted through every layer. That is the whole recipe. The black olives were the thing nobody could explain, and everybody agreed was essential. They gave it a faint brininess that cut through the richness of the Velveeta and made the whole dish taste considered rather than thrown together. A pound of beef cost 69 cents in 1975. The Velveeta was under $1. Egg noodles were a quarter. Total cost under $2 for a dish that fed 8. Tater tot casserole. This one appeared in Midwestern home kitchens around 1972, approximately 1 year after frozen tater tots became widely available in grocery stores outside the Pacific Northwest, where they had originated. And it spread through recipe card boxes and church supper tables with the efficiency of something that simply worked. Ground beef, a can of cream of mushroom soup, shredded cheddar cheese, and a layer of frozen tater tots arranged in overlapping rows across the top. It baked at 350 degrees for 45 minutes until the tots went golden and the cheese bubbled up around the edges, and the whole thing smelled of beef and cream and something golden from the oven. A bag of tots cost 79 cents in 1973. The soup was 20 cents. The beef was under $1. Under $2 for a family of 5. The food culture of the 1990s and 2000s decided that this dish was unsophisticated. Food media told people it was embarrassing. Home cooks who had made it every winter for 20 years quietly stopped making it in front of company. Chili mac. In 1974, with inflation running at 11% and gas prices doubling overnight, and the grocery budget getting squeezed from every direction at once, a working mother in Ohio discovered that 2 cans of Hormel chili and a box of elbow macaroni could feed a family of 4 in 15 minutes for under $1.50. And the discovery traveled through the neighborhood the way useful information always did, from one kitchen to the next, woman to woman, across back fences and at school pickup. She boiled the macaroni, drained it, dumped the chili in, stirred it over medium heat until the sauce coated every tube, and served it in bowls with shredded cheddar on top that melted into the heat. The whole thing took 1 pot and 15 minutes. The macaroni absorbed the chili as it sat, and the sauce got thicker and the flavor deepened. It was better 15 minutes after it left the stove than it was the moment it was served, and it was already good the moment it was served. Chocolate gravy and biscuits. This one comes from the Ozarks, from the hill country of Arkansas and Missouri, where it appeared on breakfast tables and supper tables interchangeably, and where it was considered by the people who made it to be one of the most useful recipes a person could know. Cocoa powder, sugar, flour, and milk were whisked together in a saucepan and cooked over medium heat until the mixture thickened into a glossy, dark gravy, the consistency of pudding sauce. It smelled of cocoa and something warm and slightly toasted from the flour cooking in the fat. It was poured hot over split biscuits and eaten immediately while the biscuits were still warm enough to soften under the gravy. A batch cost under 30 cents in 1975. The biscuits were another 20 cents of flour and lard. 50 cents for a breakfast that tasted like dessert and filled a person for hours. King Ranch Chicken Casserole. The dish has the name of the largest ranch in Texas, 825,000 acres, bigger than the state of Rhode Island. But nobody at the King Ranch invented it, and nobody there claims credit for it. What is known is that it appeared in junior league cookbooks across Texas in the late 1950s and reached the full extent of its popularity in the 1970s, when cream of mushroom soup had become the binding agent of an entire era of American cooking. She layered corn tortillas in a casserole dish, covered them with a mixture of cooked chicken, a can of cream of mushroom soup, a can of cream of chicken soup, canned Ro-Tel tomatoes, sour cream, and shredded cheddar, then repeated the layers and topped the whole thing with more cheese. It baked for 30 minutes until the cheese was golden and the tortillas had absorbed the sauce and become something soft and rich that was not quite pasta and not quite bread, but worked better than either. A whole chicken cost $1.29 in 1975. The soup cans were 40 cents each. Under $3 for a casserole that fed 8. Fried bologna sandwiches. Bologna cost 69 cents a pound in 1972, and it was the meat that appeared on the lunch table when the paycheck had not come yet, and the next grocery run was 3 days away. Every working-class family in every rural county in America had a pound of it in the refrigerator, as a matter of practical necessity, the way you kept aspirin in the cabinet. Not because you wanted it, but because there would come a day when you needed it. She cut the bologna into thick slices, scored the edges with a knife so they did not dome up in the pan, and fried them in a dry skillet until the cut edges curled back and the flat faces went dark and blistered and slightly crisp. The smell that came off a hot skillet of frying bologna was its own particular thing, savory and smoky and slightly sweet from the sugar in the casing, and it filled the kitchen fast. She put them on white bread with yellow mustard and sliced dill pickle, and that was supper. Under $1 for a family of 4. Weenie and bean bake. In the rural Midwest and the rural South, the combination of hot dogs and pork and beans in a baking dish constituted a complete meal that required no explanation and no apology. And every family that made it had a version that differed from the neighbor's version in ways that were considered important and were argued about with genuine conviction. She sliced hot dogs into coins and combined them with 2 cans of pork and beans, a spoon of brown sugar, a squirt of mustard, and a pour of ketchup in a baking dish. She baked the whole thing uncovered at 350 degrees for 30 minutes until the sauce had thickened and caramelized at the edges and the hot dog coins had swelled slightly and turned golden where they met the sauce. The beans went glossy and dark. The hot dogs plumped in the heat. The sugar and mustard and ketchup worked together into a sauce that was sweet and tangy and faintly smoky, and that smelled like a backyard cookout even though it had come entirely from the oven. Here is something that the history of American food almost never says plainly. The 1970s were the decade when everything got expensive at once. The working family in a ranch house in Indiana, or a farmhouse in Tennessee, or a double-wide in West Virginia was not cooking cheap because they thought it was charming. They were cooking cheap because the money was running out before the month did, and there were children at the table who did not know that and did not need to know that. The woman who invented a new way to make a can of beans stretch to 5 plates was not doing something small. She was doing the thing that kept the household together. The recipes in this video are not poverty tourism, and they are not vintage novelties. They are the engineering solutions of people under real pressure. And they worked, and they fed people, and they deserve to be remembered as exactly that. Not as comfort food, as competence. Salmon patties. A single can of pink salmon cost 49 cents in 1975, and it made 4 patties that could feed a family of 4 as a main course, which made canned salmon one of the most efficient proteins in the American grocery store during the decade of inflation that defined the 1970s. She drained the can and flaked the salmon into a bowl, bones and all. The canning process had softened the small bones completely, and they added calcium without any detectable texture. She added a beaten egg, a handful of cracker crumbs or bread crumbs, a spoon of mustard, a little grated onion, salt and pepper, and formed the mixture into flat patties. She fried them in butter in a skillet over medium heat until they were deep golden brown on both sides and the crumbs had crisped into a crust. The patties smelled of pan-fried fish and butter and something slightly briny from the salmon. Pintos and cornbread. This was the Monday supper in 1,000 rural Southern and Appalachian kitchens, and it required almost nothing and delivered almost everything. Dried pinto beans soaked overnight, then simmered for hours with a ham hock and onion until the beans had gone completely soft and the broth had thickened and turned smoky and deep, served alongside a cast iron skillet of cornbread made from nothing more than cornmeal, buttermilk, an egg, and a little lard. A bag of dried pinto beans cost 25 cents in 1973. A ham hock was 20 cents. Cornmeal was another quarter. Under $1 for a supper that fed 8. The beans were ladled into heavy bowls, and the cornbread was crumbled into them by some and eaten alongside by others, and a jar of chow-chow relish went on the table to cut through the richness of the pot liquor. And nobody at that table felt they were eating a lesser meal because nobody thought it was one. Velveeta shells and Ro-Tel. This recipe has only 2 ingredients and requires about 8 minutes and produces something so far beyond what its ingredients suggest that the first time a person makes it, they usually stand in the kitchen and eat it directly from the pot before it makes it to a bowl. A block of Velveeta and a can of Ro-Tel diced tomatoes with green chilies, melted together in a saucepan over low heat, stirred until the cheese dissolved into the tomatoes, and the whole thing became a thick, bright orange sauce that was simultaneously creamy and spicy, and slightly acidic from the tomatoes, and deeply savory from the processed cheese. Poured over a box of cooked shells, it coated every shell completely and pooled in the ridges. A block of Velveeta cost $1.19 in 1981. A can of Ro-Tel was 29 cents. A box of shells was a quarter. Under $2 for a dish that fed 5. 7-layer casserole. This dish appeared in Midwestern church cookbooks throughout the 1970s under various names. Sometimes 7-layer casserole, sometimes depression casserole, sometimes just the name of the woman who had brought it to the potluck so many times it had become identified with her. The layers were ground beef, uncooked rice, canned corn, canned tomatoes, sliced onion, diced green pepper, and strips of bacon laid across the top. Everything went into the baking dish raw and uncooked, and the dish was covered tightly with foil and baked at 350 degrees for 90 minutes. The rice cooked in the liquid from the tomatoes and the beef. The beef cooked in the steam. The bacon rendered on top and crisped in the last 15 minutes when the foil came off. Total cost in 1975, under $2.50 for a dish that fed 8. Chicken divan. Before anyone had heard of chicken tikka masala or chicken shawarma or any of the dishes that arrived in American mainstream cooking in the 1990s and 2000s, The special occasion chicken dish in a country kitchen in the 1970s was chicken divan, and it had been the special occasion chicken dish since a restaurant called the Divan Parisien in New York City invented it sometime in the early 20th century. She layered cooked broccoli in a baking dish, covered it with sliced cooked chicken, and poured over it a sauce made from cream of chicken soup, mayonnaise, lemon juice, curry powder, and shredded cheddar. She topped the whole thing with crushed Ritz crackers and a little more cheese, and baked it until the top was golden and the sauce was bubbling. It has almost entirely disappeared. What replaced it was not better. It was just newer. Frito pie. In 1931, or thereabouts, the exact date and the exact person are both disputed, as they always are with the best American food inventions. Someone in Texas poured chili directly into a bag of corn chips and handed it to a hungry person as a complete meal. By the 1970s, Frito pie had become the cafeteria lunch, the Friday night football concession stand staple, and the potluck contribution of every county in Texas and every surrounding state with any sense. She opened a bag of Fritos down one long side, ladled hot chili directly into the bag, topped it with shredded cheddar and diced raw onion, and handed it over with a spoon. The Fritos softened slightly from the heat of the chili, but retained enough crunch to provide texture with every bite. The salt of the chips against the spiced meat of the chili, against the sharpness of the raw onion, was a combination that required no improvement and received none. A can of chili cost 39 cents in 1974. A bag of Fritos was a quarter. Under $1 for a complete meal eaten from its own container. Weenie wraps. This is the recipe that every mother in America who had children between 1972 and 1988 made at least once a week, and that is only a slight exaggeration. A can of refrigerated crescent roll dough, opened along the perforated lines into 8 triangles, each wrapped around a hot dog starting at the wide end, rolled to the point, and baked at 375 degrees for 12 to 15 minutes until the dough was golden and the hot dog had swelled inside it, and the whole thing smelled of baked bread and cooked meat. A can of crescent rolls cost 49 cents in 1979. A package of hot dogs was 69 cents. Under $1.20 for a dinner that 8 children ate with complete enthusiasm. Soup, beans, and souse. In Appalachian Kentucky and Tennessee and West Virginia, this combination constituted a complete supper that needed no explanation to anyone who had grown up there, and needed considerable explanation to anyone who had not. Soup beans were pinto beans slow-cooked with a piece of salt pork or a ham hock until the broth turned thick and smoky, and the beans had given up their individual shape and become part of the liquid around them. They were served in deep bowls with the pot liquor and eaten with cornbread. Souse, also called head cheese in some counties and pressed pork in others, was the cold, gelatinous loaf made from the parts of the hog that could not be sold as anything else. The head, the feet, the hocks, simmered until the meat fell away, and the natural gelatin of the bones set the cooking liquid into a firm loaf, flavored with vinegar and sage and black pepper. It was sliced thin and eaten cold alongside the hot soup beans, the vinegar cutting through the richness of the pork broth. Total cost in 1973, under $1, for a supper that fed the whole family. The souse had been made from scraps that cost almost nothing. The beans were dried and cheap. Goulash with Velveeta. The American goulash that appeared in Midwestern kitchens throughout the 1970s was already a long way from its Hungarian ancestor, and the version that added a block of Velveeta to the standard ground beef and tomato and macaroni formula took it one step further into territory that was entirely its own and entirely satisfying. She browned ground beef with onion and garlic, added a can of diced tomatoes and a can of tomato sauce and a cup of water. brought it to a simmer, added elbow macaroni directly to the pot, and cooked it until tender. Then she stirred in half a block of Velveeta, cut into cubes, and waited while it melted into the sauce and turned the whole thing from a tomato-based pasta to something creamier and richer and more deeply savory. Bologna and egg scramble. This was the Friday breakfast for supper in a particular kind of rural American household. The household where the week had been long, the grocery money had run short, and the children still needed a hot meal before bed that tasted like something rather than like nothing. She diced bologna into small cubes and fried them in a dry skillet until they had crisped at the edges and released their fat into the pan. She poured beaten eggs over the top and scrambled everything together, the eggs setting around the bologna pieces and absorbing the rendered fat that flavored the whole thing with something savory and slightly smoky. A pound of bologna cost 69 cents in 1976. A half dozen eggs were 50 cents. Under $1.20 for a supper that fed 4. Chipped beef gravy on toast. Every American soldier who served between 1910 and 1975 knew this dish by a name that is not printable in a family-friendly video. And they brought that name and that dish home with them. And it became a regular supper in households where someone had served, and then spread outward from those households into the surrounding community until it existed everywhere. Dried beef, thin, intensely salty, almost translucent slices of cured beef that came in a small glass jar, was torn into pieces and simmered in a white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk until the sauce had thickened and the beef had softened slightly and had flavored the sauce with its salt and its depth. The whole thing was poured over buttered white toast and eaten immediately. Flour, gravy over bread. The supper of last resort that turned flour, grease, and milk into a gravy poured over plain bread when there was nothing else in the house. Flour cost a few cents in 1973. Bacon grease, milk, and bread. Total then under 15 cents. Today, under $2. Fed 4. You brown flour in bacon grease until nutty. You whisk in milk until it thickens. You pour it over slices of bread. The gravy goes thick and creamy. The bread soaks it up. The grease gives it richness. Flour gravy over bread came from Depression-era and Appalachian poverty cooking. By 1973, it was still a last resort supper in the poorest homes. Flour and grease turned into a supper that filled the belly. Milk toast. The gentle supper of buttered toast in warm, sweet milk. Comfort for the thinnest nights and the sickbed alike. Stale bread cost nothing. Milk, butter, and sugar. Total then under 10 cents. Today under $2. Fed 3. You toast and butter bread. You warm milk with sugar. You tear the toast into bowls and pour the milk over. The toast soaks up the milk and goes soft. The butter melts through. The sugar makes it gentle. Milk toast came from universal sickroom and poverty traditions. By the 1970s, it was still a comfort supper in the poorest homes. Warm milk and toast, comfort when there was nothing else. Beans and rice. The supper that fed more families through more hard times than any other. A pot of beans and a pot of rice, together costing almost nothing. A bag of beans cost 25 cents in 1973. Today, around $2. Rice, onion, and a little bacon. Total then under 50 cents. Today, under $4. Fed 8. You simmer beans with onion and bacon until creamy. You cook rice separately. You serve the beans over the rice. The beans go soft and savory. The rice soaks up the broth. The bacon flavors everything. Beans and rice came from African, Caribbean, and Southern traditions. By 1973, it was a universal budget supper nationwide. The two cheapest foods that fed the most people. Liver and onions on the cheap. The supper that took the cheapest cut at the butcher, beef liver, and turned it into a rich meal with onions and gravy. Beef liver cost 12 cents a pound in 1972. Today, around $2.49. Onions, flour, and grease. Total then under 30 cents. Today, under $5. Fed 4. You slice the liver thin and dredge it in flour. You cook onions until soft. You sear the liver fast and add a little broth. The liver goes rich, the onions go sweet. The gravy ties it together. Liver and onions came from immigrant and Southern thrift cooking. By 1972, it was a budget supper nationwide. The cheapest cut turned into the richest supper. Fried rice from leftovers. The supper that turned leftover rice and scraps into a full skillet meal with a couple of eggs and a splash of soy sauce. Leftover rice cost nothing. Eggs, onion, and soy sauce. Total then under 30 cents. Today under $3. Fed 4. You fry leftover rice in grease with onion. You push it aside and scramble eggs. You stir everything together with soy sauce. The rice goes crisp. The eggs scatter throughout. The soy sauce flavors it all. Fried rice from leftovers came from Chinese-American thrift cooking. By 1973, it was a leftover rescue supper nationwide. Yesterday's rice turned into today's full skillet. You remember the plate set in front of you. You never knew how thin that week had been. She made sure of that. The worry was hers to carry, not yours. Potato soup with milk. The thin, comforting soup that turned a few potatoes and some milk into a warming pot of supper. Potatoes cost 20 cents for 5 pounds in 1973. Today, around $3. Milk, onion, and butter. Total then under 40 cents. Today under $4. Fed 5. You simmer diced potatoes with onion until soft. You add milk and butter and heat through. The soup goes creamy, the potatoes break down. The whole pot is gentle and warm. Potato soup came from Irish and Eastern European thrift cooking. By 1973, it was a budget comfort supper nationwide. A few potatoes and milk, a warming pot of supper. Bread omelet. The supper that stretched a couple of eggs by soaking torn bread in them before frying into a filling omelet. Stale bread cost nothing. Eggs, milk, and grease. Total then under 20 cents. Today under $3. Fed 3. You soak torn bread in beaten egg and milk. You fry it in a skillet, folding it like an omelet. The omelet goes golden. The bread keeps it filling. The eggs hold it together. Bread omelet came from European and American poverty cooking. By the 1970s, it was a budget supper in homes that needed to stretch eggs. 2 eggs and stale bread stretched into a full omelet. Tuna and crackers casserole. The supper that layered a can of tuna with crushed crackers and cream soup into a baked dish. A can of tuna cost 29 cents in 1973. Today, around $1.89. Crackers, cream of mushroom soup, and milk. Total, then, under 60 cents. Today, under $5. Fed 5. You mix tuna with soup and milk. You layer it with crushed crackers in a dish. You bake at 350 for 30 minutes. The casserole bubbles. The crackers soften into it. The tuna flakes throughout. Tuna and crackers casserole came from American thrift cooking. By 1973, it was a budget supper nationwide. A can of tuna stretched into a whole baked supper. Vegetable scrap soup. The end-of-week soup that simmered every garden scrap and trimming with a bone into a full pot of supper. Garden scraps cost nothing. A bone, onion, and salt. Total, then, under 15 cents. Today, under $3. Fed 8. You simmer a bone with onion and water. You add every vegetable scrap from the week. You simmer until tender. The broth goes rich. The vegetables soften. Nothing in the kitchen goes to waste. Vegetable scrap soup came from universal poverty cooking. By the 1970s, it was a Saturday supper in thrifty homes everywhere. Every scrap in the kitchen turned into one pot of supper. Pork chop mushroom bake. The Sunday supper that took the cheapest pork chops and a can of cream of mushroom soup and turned them into something tender enough to cut with a fork. A can of cream of mushroom soup cost 12 cents in 1958. Today, around $1.29. Pork chops, onion, and rice. Total then under $1.50. Today, under $9. Fed 4. You brown the pork chops in a skillet. You spread rice in a baking dish. You mix the soup with water and pour it over the rice. You lay the chops on top. You cover and bake at 350 for 1 hour. The chops go fork tender. The rice absorbs the mushroom soup. The whole dish goes golden and creamy. The pork chop mushroom bake appeared in Campbell's cookbooks in the 1950s. By 1958, it was a Sunday supper standard in working-class American homes. Cheap chops made tender. A can of soup made it possible. Glorified chicken. The recipe that made plain baked chicken feel special, with nothing more than a can of cream of mushroom soup poured over the top. The name said everything about the era's faith in canned soup. A can of cream of mushroom soup cost 12 cents in 1958. Today, around $1.29. Chicken pieces, paprika, and butter. Total then under $1. Today, under $8. Fed 5. You arrange chicken pieces in a baking dish. You dot them with butter and dust with paprika. You pour cream of mushroom soup over the top. You bake at 375 for 1 hour until the chicken is tender and the soup browns. The soup goes golden and bubbling. The chicken stays moist underneath. The paprika gives it color. Glorified chicken appeared in Campbell's cookbooks in the 1950s as proof that a can of soup could elevate the plainest meal. By 1958, it was a weeknight standard nationwide. A can of soup that turned plain chicken into something the family asked for again. Green bean casserole, the most famous Campbell's recipe ever created. The dish that appeared on more American holiday tables than any other, and that almost nobody makes from the original recipe anymore. A can of cream of mushroom soup cost 12 cents in 1955. Today, around $1.29. Green beans, milk, soy sauce, and French's fried onions. Total then under 50 cents. Today, under $5. Fed 8. You mix cream of mushroom soup with milk, soy sauce, and pepper. You stir in cooked green beans and half the fried onions. You pour it into a baking dish. You bake at 350 for 25 minutes. You scatter the rest of the onions on top and bake 5 minutes more. The casserole bubbles at the edges. The onions go crisp and golden. The sauce coats every bean. Green bean casserole was invented by Dorcas Riley in the Campbell's Test Kitchen in Camden, New Jersey in 1955. By 1960, it was the single most requested holiday side dish in America. 40 million tables. One 12-cent can. The most American recipe ever printed on a label. Bean soup Frankfurter bake. The supper that combined a can of bean soup with sliced franks into a hearty baked dish that fed a family of 6 for under $1. A can of bean soup cost 12 cents in 1959. Today, around $1.29. Frankfurters, onion, brown sugar, and mustard. Total then under $1. Today under $7. Fed 6. You slice francs into coins. You mix bean soup with brown sugar, mustard, and onion. You stir in the francs. You pour it into a baking dish. You bake at 375 for 30 minutes. The beans go thick and glossy. The francs plump and brown. The sauce turns dark and sweet. The bean soup Frankfurter bake appeared in Campbell's cookbooks in the 1950s as a budget supper. By 1959, it was a working-class weeknight standard nationwide. A can of beans and a pack of francs. A whole family fed for pocket change. Super rice skillet. The one-pan weeknight dinner that combined a can of soup, rice, and ground beef into a complete meal cooked entirely on the stovetop. A can of tomato soup cost 10 cents in 1961. Today around $1.19. Ground beef, rice, onion, and water. Total then under $1. Today under $7. Fed 5. You brown ground beef with onion. You stir in dry rice, tomato soup, and water. You cover and simmer 20 minutes until the rice goes tender. The rice absorbs the tomato soup. The beef settles into every grain. The whole skillet goes red and savory. The super rice skillet appeared in Campbell's pamphlets in the early 1960s as a one-pan supper. By 1961, it was a weeknight standard in working-class homes nationwide. One pan, one can, 20 minutes. Dinner solved. Super enchiladas. The Tex-Mex casserole made the Campbell's way, using a can of cheddar cheese soup and a can of tomato soup to build a quick enchilada bake. A can of cheddar cheese soup cost 14 cents in 1963. Today, around $1.49. Tortillas, ground beef, tomato soup, and onion. Total then under $1.50. Today, under $9. Fed 6. You brown ground beef with onion. You mix the two soups together. You layer tortillas, beef, and soup in a baking dish. You top with cheese. You bake at 375 for 30 minutes. The tortillas soften into the sauce. The cheese melts through. The two soups create a creamy, tangy sauce. Super enchiladas appeared in Campbell's cookbooks in the 1960s as an easy Tex-Mex shortcut. By 1963, they were a weeknight standard in homes across the Southwest and beyond. 2 cans of soup made an enchilada bake without a single homemade sauce.